Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 3, Episode 5, Modern Sci-Fi Television. So, this is one of those topics where I feel like I didn't adequately cover it in the first two seasons. I talked about television, of course, but I didn't talk much about recent television, especially after the streaming revolution. Part of this is that I don't follow TV myself as closely as I'd like. I've certainly never followed streaming television as well as I did broadcast or basic cable, and that includes when I was watching the cable shows like Sci-Fi Channel originals online through iTunes and the like. Plus, I've got a backlog of sci-fi TV that I want to watch but haven't gotten around to. There's the Disney Plus Marvel shows, and I've only seen the first season of Picard, and I really need to be a good Whovian and catch up on Doctor Who. I haven't been following that since Jodie Whittaker's first season. In other words, it's hard to keep up. There's so much content being made these days. But it's not just that. A few months ago, someone on YouTube, might have been Nick Nocturne, said, "When you create content, you never seem to have time to watch content." And that has really resonated with me. I'm always working on my own projects, and I can never seem to sit down, especially for large blocks of time, to consume media the old-fashioned way. This is not a catch-up episode like I did in the last season. I'm not catching up with things that are on my to-watch list. It's sort of a meta catch-up episode because it's catching up with me being aware of the existence of the latest sci-fi shows. Because I don't follow Streamly as closely, and because streaming is so much more siloed with all the different services that I don't even know what's out there. And this isn't just a problem for me. This episode was partly inspired by Cameron Kunzelman in episode 3 of this season, who pointed out the show Twisted Metal on Peacock, where, despite the fact that it's one of Peacock's most streamed series, not only had I never heard of it, but no one he knows had ever heard of it either. It's possible to have highly rated TV shows in your area of interest, and large swaths of people don't even know they exist. So, with that in mind, I had to think, how do we approach an overview of recent science fiction? It took some playing around to figure out what even worked. I tried Wikipedia and Rotten Tomatoes, but neither of them offered full coverage of what I wanted. Not consistent year to year, and not consistent about separating sci-fi and fantasy. And you may be thinking, what about Nielsen ratings? And yes, there's a place for them, which I'll come back to, but they are painfully limited in the scope of their public releases, only listing the top couple of sci-fi shows each year. And they also didn't release numbers for streaming until 2020. Nielsen can tell you what's popular to a limited degree, but it won't tell you what exists. I ultimately determined that my best bet was IMDb, which is both very comprehensive and very customizable, allowing you to search by medium, genre, release date, and popularity. Also country of origin, but going by popularity seemed fairer and still ended up being very America-centric. Now, there were still complications. If you search for TV series on IMDb, it casts a wide net that even includes unauthorized fan-made web series like Star Trek Continues. And in fact, obscure shows like that were the large majority of the listings, I think. Sorting by popularity mitigates that, but it's still by user interest and not actual viewership. So I ended up using two methods to build my list. One being the top 10-ish results for each year by user popularity, and the other being limiting the results to the largest media companies, which by their standards are Disney, Fox, Universal, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, Sony, and DreamWorks. Now, this episode isn't only about streaming. Broadcast, and 9 out of 10 times it is broadcast over cable, can still compete on equal footing. But streaming has undoubtedly become a major part of the media landscape, and so I wanted my list to follow the history of streaming. I had to look up myself what the history of streaming was, since the early years before something is widely adopted are the times when no one is paying attention to what's going on. As far as I can tell, the first ever original streaming show produced by a major platform was Hulu's Battleground in 2012, a mockumentary about political campaigning. And the first original science fiction show on streaming was Hulu's superhero show The Awesomes in 2013. And so I started building my list of recent sci-fi television with 2013. For comparison, Netflix's first original was House of Cards in 2013, and their first sci-fi original was Daredevil in 2015. Amazon Prime's first original was Bosch in 2015, and their first sci-fi original was The Man in the High Castle later that same year. As we'll see in a minute, 2015 was a big year for streaming. There's another good reason to start looking in 2013 or thereabouts. As I discussed with Jim Harris in episode 1 of this season, it takes about 10 years for the best new media to rise to the top and become quote-unquote classics. So the landscape of the past 10 years is distinct from the time before that and forms an important topic to talk about by virtue of age alone. Before I made this list, I wasn't even sure how out of the loop I was or wasn't all this time. You see, I stopped getting cable in 2011, so I thought I might need to start even farther back. But I was pleasantly surprised to find that I was still fairly tuned in until I left grad school in 2016. I just didn't remember specifically when I was paying attention to what. After that, I had a real job, among other things, and I didn't have as much time for this stuff, but I was still watching some broadcast shows like The Flash and The Orville. It was only in the pandemic years and the most recent writer's strike, plus more and more new shows moving to streaming, that I really started to lose touch. Like, what was that about Severance? Wait, they did a Halo series? Wait, there's how many new superhero shows? Wait, they did a Fallout series? It's just too much to keep track of. And so, beginning in 2013 and ending in 2023, I looked at the IMDb listings for new science fiction TV shows, as well as the Nielsen ratings, along with any other measures I could find for actual viewership when those weren't available, or weren't as complete as I'd like. Ultimately, I came to similar conclusions from the limited listings in the Nielsen ratings and from my longer IMDb list, so that's a good sign. So, what did it look like? And how did things change over that decade? In 2013, the most popular science fiction TV show was The Walking Dead, which was then in its 4th season. And it wasn't even close. 4th place overall, and the next sci-fi show, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., was 36th. The Walking Dead had 18 million viewers. According to the numbers I saw, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. had 10 million. And it did it on basic cable, premiering on AMC. Meanwhile, streaming wasn't even on the board. As a practical matter, it was mostly just a gimmick from Netflix where you could see House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. It's amazing to think how big a phenomenon The Walking Dead was back then. It was one of those rare sci-fi phenomena that went truly mainstream. Something I only saw clearly on my list with one other, Netflix's Stranger Things, beginning in 2016. Even The Mandalorian didn't pull those kinds of numbers, as far as I can tell. But that was just for the first year I looked at. For the next year or two, things stayed mostly the same. You got occasional new broadcast shows cracking the top 50 ratings like Supergirl and Limitless, but you mostly have to go actively looking for new sci-fi listings to find the latest developments. And serious sci-fi fans will recognize a number of other shows from this time frame, from kids shows like Steven Universe, to more mature animation like Rick and Morty, to Sci-Fi Channel originals like Defiance and The Expanse, not to mention new broadcast shows like The 100. Any one year could fill a whole episode, and that's without me having watched most of them. But that's not the point of this episode. The point is that all of these shows were still on broadcast and cable at the time, and the landscape wasn't really any different from the decade previous. That started to change in 2015. That year, Amazon Prime Video joined Netflix and Hulu in producing original content, and together they enjoyed a successful run of 4 or 5 years as the Big Three of online streaming. You might say 2015 is the year that streaming went mainstream, although I'd argue there were several milestones over the years, possibly as late as 2021 or even still to come in the future. Either way, 2015 is the year where you see original streaming series in IMDb's top sci-fi results, including Jessica Jones and Sense8 on Netflix and The Man in the High Castle on Amazon Prime. Clearly, the Marvel Cinematic Universe drove a fair bit of this with its Netflix exclusives, which ironically are now maybe not decanonized, but certainly apocryphal with the advent of the newer Disney Plus shows. Streaming continued to grow over the next couple years, including the premiere of Stranger Things in 2016. I'd also put HBO's remake of Westworld here, since while it's not a primary streaming service, it's still a standalone subscription service, contrasting it from basic cable. Also, YouTube originals started in 2016, but I consider that more web fiction than television. 2017 saw Hulu get what I think was its first really big title, The Handmaid's Tale, and it also saw the premiere of Star Trek Discovery, which, if it wasn't the first, was certainly the first TV show I was aware of that a broadcast network sent directly to streaming. In this case, CBS All Access, which is now Paramount+. It didn't disrupt the big three at the time, not even close, but in-house streaming platforms by major studios were definitely the shape of things to come. There's something else that's very significant about 2017. It was hard for me to find coherent ratings for streaming shows at this time, and what I could find is hard to compare with broadcast. But from what I can tell, it seems like the years 2017 to 2019 were the high watermark for science fiction in streaming. That year, an article in The Hollywood Reporter looked at the top 5 shows on each of the big 3 streaming platforms, Amazon, Netflix, and Hulu, and of those 15 shows, 6 of them were science fiction. The Man in the High Castle and The Tick on Amazon Prime, Stranger Things and Marvel's The Defenders on Netflix, and The Handmaid's Tale and 11/22/63 on Hulu. That's wildly different from television, which as far as I can tell never got that many sci-fi shows in the top 100 in the years I studied. Likewise, in 2018, 8 of Netflix's own top 20 shows were science fiction. And in 2019, 8 of the top streaming shows overall were sci-fi. And keep in mind, the 3 were not equal here. Netflix was incredibly dominant in the market. 7 of those 8, and in fact 19 of the 20, were all Netflix shows, the one exception being The Handmaid's Tale. Also, The Mandalorian did premiere in 2019, but it was too late in the year to place that high. What happened in 2017 through 2019? Why was streaming so different from broadcast in those years specifically? I only have guesses here. A cursory Google search doesn't turn up anything, and I honestly don't know where to look to dig deeper. My gut feeling is that streaming had been in the public consciousness for a couple of years, so more people were paying attention. But at the same time, streaming subscribers, especially in the early years, tended to be younger and nerdier than average, and thus more likely to watch science fiction. Also, there's the money factor. In television, just like movies, major studios will go for the biggest and safest cash grabs and be averse to taking chances, especially in the primetime slots. The Simpsons is going into season 36 despite not being good since season 9. Meanwhile, Firefly gets shafted by the executives and canceled after 1 season, grumble grumble. But the point is, a streaming platform, especially in the early years, offered a lower-cost, lower-risk platform where a network could try more niche or experimental series without interrupting its lucrative primetime lineup. Also different schedules than the usual sweeps months. And that allowed them to offer genre fiction like sci-fi a more welcoming home. All the more so when you consider shows like The Expanse and The Orville that were dropped by cable and broadcast networks and picked up by streaming platforms. And I admit I don't have any hard evidence for this, but I do notice that the number of broadcast sci-fi shows in the top 100 dropped dramatically in 2018 and stayed there, which also fits the pattern. However, the landscape changed again in 2020, for 2 big reasons. First, the big 3 streamers became the big 5, with both Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus debuting in late 2019. And soon to be the big 8 with the launch of NBC's Peacock, HBO's Max Originals, and the rebranding of Paramount Plus over the following 18 months. Technically there's also Discovery Plus and ESPN Plus, but they don't do fiction. And the second, even bigger factor to affect streaming was of course the COVID pandemic. Suddenly, at the same time streaming was getting bigger than ever, all the new movies were being released on streaming. Where 5 years earlier they might have been delayed, gone to Amazon and iTunes rental services, or even written off entirely. Likewise, all the live TV shows and shows with a faster production cycle, like reality shows, were canceled, and while locked down, people had more time on their hands to begin with. Suddenly, people who weren't interested or weren't familiar with the streaming services had many new reasons to subscribe. In that light, it may not be a coincidence that 2020 was also the first year for which I could find Nielsen ratings for streaming shows. But I worry that the pandemic years have not done any favors to science fiction. At least when it comes to the cream of the crop, everybody watches them shows like The Walking Dead and Stranger Things. Because from 2020 onward, the top streaming shows in the ratings look a lot more like the top broadcast shows. At least for dramas, maybe not reality shows. While in the late teens, 40% of the top streaming shows were science fiction, in the 2020s, it's been more like 20%. Not a complete regression to the mean, but a definite shift in that direction. And another worrying sign is that shows acquired from broadcast are taking up a larger share of streaming minutes compared with originals. In 2022, original shows were a minority of minutes watched, but not by much. Plus, Stranger Things got number 1 overall, which is an incredible feat for a science fiction show. But in 2023, originals were down to more like a quarter of minutes watched and didn't have any shows in the top 10 overall. And at the same time, the numbers for direct viewership of broadcast and cable shows are down a lot. In the 2013-14 season, the number 4 show was The Walking Dead, and it got 18 million viewers. In the 2022-23 season, the number 4 show was NCIS, and it only got 9 million viewers. This year it was Tracker, which did a little better, but the numbers are still down by nearly half. And I suspect those viewers are moving to streaming. As a side note, in the 2023-24 season, the political commentators Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity cracked the top 100 for the first time, which I suspect to be less on their own merits and more on the decline of everything else. And another worrying sign, this year I've been seeing articles about streaming being on the decline, or at least stalled. How the networks are struggling to grow their subscriber bases. How it's not living up to the promise of the past few years in terms of profitability. How consumers are growing dissatisfied with rising prices combined with an increased number of major platforms. It would be a shame if streaming became cable 2.0 with all the problems that led people to cut the cord in the first place, and maybe we'll avoid that in the next few years, but it feels like a definite possibility to me. But I'm getting sidetracked here. I've said a lot about the shape of the media in general, but this podcast is about science fiction. And as I always do when looking at contemporary media, I want to see what the latest developments say about where science fiction is and where it's going. And it's superheroes. The answer is superheroes. Even if they peaked in 2019 with Avengers Endgame, the market is still flooded with superheroes. And this is something I saw from both the Nielsen ratings and my longer list of top hits from IMDb. Fully 1/3 of the TV shows on my list are about superheroes, or at least comic book adjacent. You've got your Marvel Cinematic Universe, your DC heroes, your non-MCU Marvel stories like X-Men, superhero adjacent stories like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Gotham, and Krypton, stories outside the two heavyweights like The Umbrella Academy, Invincible, and The Boys. There's a huge number of them. Now, another third of the shows on my list, albeit fewer of them high in the ratings, are what I call typical Hollywood fare. Adaptations, usually of books, but sometimes of video games, along with remakes, spin-offs, sequels, and long-running franchises in general like Star Trek and Star Wars. And I've said before that I feel like we learn the least from these because they're just easy money to Hollywood. They're making them because they have an established audience rather than because they're a trend in the genre. And that's not to say any of these are bad. I mean, some of them are bad, but some of them are very good. The Expanse and The Handmaid's Tale have earned huge followings through the TV shows in their own right. The Man in the High Castle, Altered Carbon, and even Foundation, for all the criticism leveled at that last one, have brought new attention to some perhaps less well-read classics. And on the video game side, I know The Last of Us was very well received, even if I'm less familiar with the others. What about the remaining third? The shows that are originals, or are at least based on properties I haven't heard of. What are the trends in sci-fi we can identify from these? Well, for one, time travel is in. I was surprised how many time travel shows appeared on the list. Most notably Timeless, La Brea, The Man in the High Castle Again, and 11/22/63. But there are a half dozen more on the long list. Robots, to my surprise, are out. AI is a big deal these days, and there are a few shows about the singularity, but classic stories about robots like, say, the Sarah Connor Chronicles from 2008 aren't really around at all, with the only significant titles being Almost Human, Raised by Wolves, and of course Westworld. Post-apocalyptic and dystopian stories are perennial favorites. From things as mundane as Severance and Squid Game to as exotic as The Last of Us, people are always up for a good broken world or end-of-the-world story. Aliens and space exploration are doing pretty well, whether it's in space like The Expanse or on Earth like Roswell. I certainly feel like those are doing better than they did a decade ago. Alternate history is still very niche, but it's better known than it's ever really been in the past, not just with The Man in the High Castle, but also For All Mankind, about an alternate space race. Military, on the other hand, is out. Post-apocalyptic and dystopian stories are quite common, but you don't see much overtly military sci-fi like Stargate was, except for Halo. In our current cultural context, I don't think that's too surprising. And I think that animation is in, including traditional 2D animation. Adult-oriented animation is nothing new, it goes back at least to The Simpsons. But I feel like the streaming era has brought about a renaissance in the genre, with both cable shows like Rick and Morty and streaming shows like Invincible. And that's not limited to sci-fi. Vox Machina is an animated Dungeons & Dragons-inspired fantasy series, and has been very successful. On the whole, I don't know that I would say contemporary sci-fi is lacking much. Even for the less popular categories, you can still find something, except perhaps for things that haven't been in vogue for ages like Pulp Fiction, or things that don't play well in a series format like disaster movies. I do think it's a little stuck in a rut with superheroes, if you even consider superheroes to be sci-fi to begin with, but there's plenty of other stuff out there. But in the end, what I really think will decide the future of the genre, at least on television, is the future of streaming itself. I've come to conclude over the years that the problem with streaming is not lower absolute viewership, as I'd originally thought, but siloing. People are only aware of shows on the services they subscribe to, myself included, and sometimes not even those. For example, I was completely unaware that there was a TV series of Tales from the Loop on Amazon Prime, which I had previously only known from the Curious Archive YouTube channel, which does video essays about those sorts of topics. Meanwhile, my long list was missing two recent shows that have come up prominently in those video essays: Scavenger's Reign on Max and Carol and the End of the World on Netflix. The fact that they didn't show up highly ranked on IMDb suggests that other people aren't very aware of them. And also, a small number of the shows on my list were on platforms I'd never heard of, like DC Universe and MGM+. All this means that science fiction is becoming more balkanized. Trends in one part of society won't necessarily be mirrored in another. And that is a story that we won't know how it ends until we know what happens to streaming over the next 5 to 10 years, or maybe longer. And God only knows what AI will do. For all we know, in 10 years the entire studio system could be breaking down under the weight of AI-generated content. It all depends on what direction things go. But now it's time for the million-dollar questions. First, are there any new series that I will be picking up after doing all this research? And the answer is maybe. I want to at least try Tales from the Loop. And Monarch Legacy of Monsters might be worth a look. Those are the only ones I was completely unaware of that interest me, although a fair number of others have been on my to-maybe watch list for a while, with varying degrees of confidence. The other question, of course, is, are there any new sci-fi shows that I have seen that I would recommend to you, the listeners? And, now that I'm looking, I think the last sci-fi TV show I actually finished was Defiance, which ended in 2015. Yikes. I mean, I've seen whole seasons since then. I got through season 1 of The Expanse, that was in 2016. I gave up on The Flash in Season 3, that was 2017. I gave up on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in Season 5, also 2017. And both of those were for the same reason. Say it with me, time travel ruins any story that's not specifically about time travel. Anyway, I kept up with the Orville and Doctor Who until 2019. But since then, I don't think I've gotten through a whole season of anything. Well, actually, yes, I have. I got through Captain America and the Winter Soldier, and I got through Ms. Marvel. But I want to do the Disney Plus shows separately. So, I feel kind of weird recommending a show I didn't finish myself, but I have very little bad to say about the Orville. It's funny, it's lighthearted, it's classic space opera. It's very much a love letter to Star Trek The Next Generation. And it may be saying something about myself that I haven't seen Strange New Worlds, but out of the shows I have seen, The Orville is my recommendation. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major podcasting platforms. If you like this podcast and want to support it, please consider joining my Patreon. You can find me under Science Meets Fiction, and you can get early access to a lot of my stuff there. You can find my other work on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter, Mastodon, and Blue Sky at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. In the next episode, I will be doing my first author feature of Season 3, where I will be examining the works of Samuel R. Delany. Thanks for listening.